Hey, discipleship groups, we are in Mark 13 this week, and I'm excited because this is a really difficult passage of scripture, and I also think some of us probably came to this passage really excited to talk about eschatology and end times, and I think there's probably another group who is probably really nervous and hesitant. I know for me, anytime I approach an end times passage, I get a little nervous because it's like, this is really hard to understand. Also, I have observed passages like this be manipulated in some instances, and so I think it's important for us to come with this with just a huge posture of humility and saying, Lord, I recognize I'm not going to come to a full understanding with everything, but what can I walk away? One, understanding who God is, and also understanding how I'm to live in the world. And when we ask those two questions in passages like this, we typically can walk away with a firm understanding. We'll see two big things. We'll see God's control over all things, including what appears to be chaos of the end times, but also the urgency that we're to live in the middle of that. And so as we look at Mark chapter 13, there's just kind of this weird tension that we get to live in. Jesus is clearly talking about the destruction of the temple, which would have been highly offensive to the Jews. The disciples would have been offended just because of the pride of knowing, hey, this is our temple where God's presence lives. It's our refuge. This is something that the Jewish people would have been highly offended of, including the disciples. And so Jesus talking about this isn't something to be read as like flippant. Like, this is serious what he's talking about. And on top of that, he weaves in, as he's talking about the clear destruction in 70 AD that will take place, he's clearly talking about things as well that are happening in the far off future. And then he weaves in things like in verse 14, where he talks about this abomination of the desolation, which also is apocryphal language that is used in the book of Daniel that the disciples would have picked up on. And so there's this weird tension of Jesus clearly talking about things that are happening now, but he's clearly talking about things that are happening in the future. And it's important to as we read this text, to not read it in a way where we're trying to place things in a timeline, or to say this part is only talking about the now, or this part is only talking about the future. It's important to ask the question, how is this describing the circumstances of the end times, and why is Jesus talking in this nature? And it's also just an observation and thing to recognize is apocryphal writings, both we see in Revelation, we see in Daniel, and we also see just in so many extra biblical apocryphal writings in between the end of the Old Testament and the writing of Matthew, where it was common literary practice or in speech to talk about near-term events and then to use those to describe how things in the future would happen. And so it's important to recognize this, that not all of these are perfectly descriptive of a timeline, but they are prescriptive of how things will look and feel as we approach the end times. And so I just want to read some of the urgent statements. There's clear that there should be urgency as this time approaches. We see in verse 5, watch out that no one deceives you. Don't be alarmed. Be on guard, it says in verse 9. In verse 23, you must watch out. I've told you everything in advance. Learn this lesson. Recognize that it is the time is near. Watch, be alert, it says in verse 33. Be alert, it says in verse 35. Be alert, it says at the end of the chapter. It's clear that Jesus is trying to help us understand that yes, there is going to be chaos in the world, but we as believers should be alert, be ready, and live with urgency. You know, we take so much time for granted, but it is the one resource that we don't get back. We should live with gospel urgency. we should live with this urgency because ultimately our time is limited. Whether we will pass away in death or if Jesus will return before that time, there should be an urgency to our days. We take for granted the time that we've been given. And Jesus here, as he's talking to the disciples, he is demonstrating this urgency that we should have as we live about being a part of his kingdom. The second thing that we see is that the king is in control. King Jesus is in control. There's a lot of chaos outlined in these scriptures. There's a lot of bad things. There's a lot of persecution. There's a lot of worries. And what's clear is even though Jesus outlines this chaos, it's clear that he is still in control. And that's an important posture for us as the church to maintain. You know, we live in a society that can get whipped up in fear and anxiety really quickly. You look over the past several years how there is economic uncertainty, there is political uncertainty, both at home and abroad. And it's interesting how, you know, we as people can get so wrapped up in that anxiety and fear. But Jesus here is demonstrating, hey, there's going to be a lot of anxiety and fear as the end approaches, but I am the one in control. King Jesus holds and sustains all things. So because of that, the fear and anxiety are real things. There are clear persecutions that are not easy and should not be trivialized. But if Jesus is in control, we can rest in him. We can know, Lord, this is really hard, this is difficult, these circumstances are not ideal, but I can persevere because I know that you are with me. I can be urgent because I know you are with me. I can lose everything because I know you are with me. The fact that Jesus is in control should frame our thoughts when we look at news, when we look at circumstances in the world around us and say, you know what? This is terrifying. This is not good. This is not necessarily honoring to the Lord, but he is in control of all things. And because of that, I can trust him. I can ultimately rest in him. And as I rest in him, I will live with urgency with this gospel message. And so I hope as you talk in your groups today, I hope you wrestle with how can we find peace in this chaos? How do we live with urgency? How do we live as verse 35 says, hey, be alert since we don't know when King Jesus is returning. How can we live with this urgency? And how are we okay wrestling with the tension of not knowing the exact what, but we know the how things are going to begin to piece together, and how that's okay to live in that tension. How it might actually be better for us to live in that tension of not knowing the clear what and timeline of what will take place. This text offers a ton of fun conversation, but ultimately it reminds us that the Lord holds all things in his hand. And Jesus is reminding his disciples, and he's reminding us that as well. So I hope you have a great time discussing in your groups, and we'll see you next time.